The pager hammered against Harper Vance's ribs like something alive and pissed off. One hard buzz, then another, fast enough to skip past annoyance and land in her spine. By the time she hit the edge of the blast yard, the air already tasted burned. It smelled of diesel and cordite, while salt blown off the water laid over everything like wet metal. Men were shouting over one another near the center of the pier, all of them dragged toward the same blackened shape, crumpled in the open. Smoke moved low in the crosswind, flattening against the grating, then lifting in ugly breaths. Koa came in tight on her left, silent, harness warm from the run. He should have lunged toward the obvious body with everybody else. Instead, the dog cut speed and locked down. His tail dropped. The lead went rigid in her hand. Somebody ahead yelled for a medic. Somebody else yelled for a litter. And behind the noise, Harper felt Koa fix on something past the blast center toward the technical fence, where a second shape lay half-shadowed under drifting gray. Boots scraped hot grit. Radios stepped on each other. Somewhere in the wreckage, steel hissed as it cooled. A good working dog didn't chase the loudest thing. It froze where the lie began. Harper angled off before she had fully decided to, boots ticking blown fragments across the metal deck. The crowd noticed late, the way people noticed a wrong turn only when someone took it with confidence. A crewman with soot-streaked cheeks barked, "Wrong body," and another voice, thin with adrenaline, said the dog had gone bad from the blast. Nobody sounded cruel. They sounded busy. Busy people buried the truth every day and called it efficiency. Koa never spared the burned shape in the open so much as a glance. He stood at the fence-line corpse, with every muscle held still under the coat, nostrils working, certainty traveling up the leash in tiny living shocks. Harper dropped to one knee. Heat rolled across the pier in waves, then broke under the colder draft, blowing in off the water. The body at center was spectacle. This one was arithmetic. The choice sat there in front of her before she ever touched the skin. One death was pulling every eye by force. The other had been tucked away like somebody hoped smoke would do the rest. She set her bag down and tugged one glove free with her teeth, then the other, thumb rubbing once across the side of her index finger before she seated the nitrile tight, habit, anchor. The wrist she reached for was cold in the wrong way, not the broad cooling of a body that had taken the full heat of a blast and lain where it fell. This was cooler under the skin than it should have been out here. Tucked half out of sight, one sleeve singed but not devoured. Soot kissed the fabric. It didn't own it. She touched the inside of the wrist, then the neck, then paused with two fingers near the angle of the jaw without saying a word. Behind her, the comments sharpened. Somebody muttered that Koa had found a perimeter casualty. Somebody else said triage was backing up. Koa stayed statue still. Harper could hear his breathing now, slow and measured under the radio chatter and the soft hiss of cooling metal. Blast scenes made amateurs trust noise. Harper trusted pattern. Too much cloth had survived. Too little heat had claimed him. The placement against the fence read, arranged the second she let her eyes take in the empty patch around the boots. She rose just enough to make herself visible and planted one hand on the second body's shoulder before anyone else could claim it with a tag. Nobody touches this one. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The sentence cut clean through the confusion because it ran against the grain of everything happening around them. A responder carrying black triage tags slowed, looked toward the burned corpse at center, then back at Harper, uncertain which disaster outranked which. Harper kept her palm where it was. Koa turned his head a fraction, eyes never leaving the body, reading her right hand the way he always did before a shift. Good. Hold. She could feel the cost of the call stacking up in real time. Delay the lane and living casualties waited longer. Be wrong, and she would spend the rest of the morning explaining why she had let a dog hijack a hot scene. Be right, and somebody had used the explosion to make everyone stare at the wrong death. Smoke rolled across the fence and thinned. Harper looked once more at the still face by her knee, then at the black ruin in the open where all the shouting kept gathering. "This wasn't just a blast accident," she said. "Start treating it like a protected scene." Chief Elena Rostova didn't waste steps. She came through the churn of stretchers and shouted counts with her chin already lifted toward the fence-line body, as if the decision had been made 3 radios ago and Harper was the last obstacle left in its path. "Move it," she said to the recovery team, clipped and flat. "Open the lane. I want this pier flowing again." The words landed in a place still hot from the last minute, still crowded with smoke and impatience and the memory of people calling the dog wrong. Harper stayed where she was, one knee in grit, one gloved hand braced on the dead man's coat. Beyond Rostova, the casualty collection point pulsed in ugly rhythm. Somebody retched. Somebody prayed without sound. The metal shifted and settled as it cooled somewhere out on the yard. Dry little noises under the radio spill. Koa stood off Harper's shoulder, silent, watching the body with that same unbearable concentration. Rostova's pressure wasn't theater. Harper could see the math of it in her face. More delay meant more exposure, more questions, more bodies waiting to be processed through a lane already choking on heat and confusion. That was what made her dangerous. She had reasons. Harper peeled her hand back from the coat and reached for the jaw. The nitrile dragged slightly against soot and dried salt on the skin. She felt the shape before she named it. Fingertips, following the lower line of bone, the way another person might follow a crack in glass. The fracture sat collapsed to one side, the break line rough under the glove, showing severe structural damage. She pressed more carefully, feeling for direction, for what had landed first and what had been added later by heat, violence, and distance. Rostova crouched opposite her with the kind of impatience that tried to look like control. "Doctor, I have live casualties stacked at triage, and a perimeter I can't hold shut forever." Harper heard what sat under it. Prove it fast or get out of the way. No rank play, no rescue by command voice, just evidence or nothing. She adjusted her grip, thumb settling under the angle of the mandible, and felt the ruined give of it again. The blast center sat out in the open behind them. The body's damage should have told one story. This jaw told another, meaner one, closer in and more personal. Rostova started to stand, ready to wave the team through, and Harper spoke before the motion could finish. "If I were staging a blast, I'd want us all looking the other way, right about now." It wasn't a flourish. It was the cleanest line she had. Rostova's eyes narrowed, not offended, just recalculating. Harper turned the dead face a few degrees with careful pressure, enough to show the asymmetry without manhandling it. "Look at the break." Her voice stayed low. "Clinical. The force is wrong for where you say he died." She touched the side of her own jaw once, then the damaged bone again. "A blast that throws from center doesn't cave this in like that on this angle. Not with this burn pattern. Not with the rest of him so lightly touched." The recovery team had gone still behind Rostova. Koa hadn't moved at all. Harper felt the whole scene balancing on a few square inches of damaged anatomy, and the few seconds Rostova could still justify giving her. "He didn't take the event the same way the burned body did," Harper said. "That means either this body wasn't where it was supposed to be when the blast went up, or the blast isn't the main event." She let that sit. No lecture, just the hard edge of one contradiction lodged where procedure could not swallow it cleanly. For a second, Rostova looked past Harper toward the center of the yard, toward the black body pulling every eye by sheer brutality. And Harper could watch the argument happen without a word. Flow the lane and keep the machine moving. Or admit the machine might be processing the wrong story. Somewhere behind them, a stretcher wheel rattled over grating. Somewhere farther out, steel clicked and settled, as if the pier itself were cooling down one thought at a time. Rostova exhaled through her nose. "Hold this body," she said at last, not to Harper, but to the team. No movement until I say otherwise. Nobody celebrated. Harper would have distrusted it if they had. Relief came through the scene crooked and partial. She had bought minutes, not safety. Bought scrutiny, not trust. The recovery team backed off. Koa's shoulders eased, by a degree so small only she would notice. Rostova stayed crouched long enough to let the order hurt. If this stalls the line for nothing, it's on you. Harper nodded once. Fair, the cost had been named. Across the casualty point, new shouting broke loose as another survivor was brought in from the smoke. Harper looked up toward it before the sound had fully formed words, fingers still resting on the dead man's ruined jaw, already feeling the scene widen into the next problem. The shouting at the casualty point shifted pitch when they brought Caleb Trent in. It wasn't louder so much as sharper. A man who could still walk always pulled a different kind of attention than the dead. Harper looked up from stripping off her first pair of gloves and saw him coming between two corpsmen with his shirt torn open at the shoulder. Soot streaked across his chest, one sleeve half gone. He had enough blood on him to pass at a glance. That was the trick with scenes like this. At a glance, almost anything passed. Koa felt it before she did. The dog's posture changed beside her boot, head lowering, tail dropping hard and still. Not fear exactly, more like refusal. Caleb kept talking while they sat him down on a folding chair under the tent, voice rough but steady, already placing himself in time. He said where he had been standing, what he had heard first, which direction he had turned. Too neat, too linear. The canvas overhead snapped in the wind, making the whole tent flex like a lung. Harper crossed to him through the stink of burned cloth, iodine, and the sour animal reek of panic that clung to everybody in there. Caleb's smell stood apart. Sweat, yes. Smoke, yes. Under it, sharp and acidic, the private chemical edge of stress. He looked at her the way people looked at medics when they wanted absolution more than treatment. Ready, not pleading. Caleb had a scrape along the jawline, one reddened ear, dirt on both palms, little details a lazy witness would forget to wear. Harper gave him points for that. She didn't trust him more for it. Koa let out a low sound from deep in his chest. Not a bark, not even close, just a warning he kept mostly to himself. Zero bark had been trained into him so deep that this tiny vibration carried more threat than a shout. The two corpsmen glanced down at him and then away. One muttered that the dog must still be spun up from the blast. Harper almost said maybe. She didn't. Caleb started again before she asked a single question, handing her the story as if he had rehearsed being helpful on the ride over. He described a generator pop, a heat wave, and somebody screaming near center. He said he hit the deck, then crawled left, then tried to help, then blacked out for maybe 10 to 12 seconds. Real memory from a hot event usually came apart at the edges. It doubled back, lost time, skipped stupid things. Caleb gave her sequence, cause and effect. He even paused in the right places, as if he knew where panic ought to live. Harper saw the white placard zip tied to a tent pole over his shoulder. FOD, foreign object debris. The black stencil had been sun-faded at the edges. She filed it without knowing why. She stepped in close enough to take his wrist before he could decide whether to offer it. His skin was warm, damp, alive in the ordinary ways. The pulse jumped under her fingers, fast and thin, but it wasn't moving like a body clawing its way through shock. She expected the blunt scramble of a man who had just lived through overpressure and chaos. Caleb watched her face too carefully. Most hurt people watched her hands. Harper let 2 beats pass. 3. The tent wall cracked in the wind again. Koa stayed back near the chair leg, head low, lip barely lifting now, nose working at the air around Caleb's knees. Cortisol had a smell when enough of it leaked out at once. Not magic, not guilt made visible, just the rank chemical edge of a body bracing for exposure instead of collapse. Harper raised her eyes to Caleb's. His pupils weren't lying. He was remembering a script, not a survival memory. One of the corpsmen asked if she needed a pressure cuff. She shook her head. "Did you lose consciousness before or after you crawled?" Caleb blinked once. Tiny delay. Then he corrected himself so smoothly it almost earned admiration. Almost. He was good enough to make a tired room grateful. Harper let go of his wrist and reached as if to check the back of his neck, giving him the courtesy of continued treatment while she rearranged the scene in her head. Don't corner him. Don't tell him what you know. Not here. Not with this many ears and this much noise. Caleb kept talking, softer now, trying to recover the rhythm he had lost for that 1 second. Koa would not come closer. That mattered. The dog had ignored the biggest body on the pier and chosen the one that broke the story. Now he was rejecting the man. Everyone in the tent wanted to slot into the role of lucky survivor. Harper looked over Caleb's shoulder, toward the blown open flap of the tent. Beyond it, the yard kept moving in bursts and starts. Stretchers threading through smoke, radios stepping on each other, responders trying to turn chaos into a checklist. Somewhere in that mess was the person Caleb was buying time for. Or protecting. Maybe both. The thought landed cold and clean. The real operator was still inside the perimeter. Still moving. Her eyes snagged again on the FOD sign, on the way debris had a talent for ending up where it did the most damage, when nobody respected the small things. Harper turned back to Caleb and gave him a calm nod, like she believed every word. "Stay here," she said. "You're not done being useful yet." Harper left the triage tent without asking permission she knew she wouldn't get. The air outside hit different after the canvas heat, meaner and cleaner at once. Salt coming off the water under the burned stink that still hung over the yard. Behind her, the casualty point kept grinding through bodies and noise. Ahead of her, the edge of the pier fell away into utility runoff, drainage channels, and the kind of half-maintained space everybody ignored until it mattered. Koa moved beside her on a short lead, silent, wound tight again now that they were back in open air. He had refused Caleb without ever making a show of it. Harper trusted that more than any statement taken under fluorescent panic. She cut away from the obvious lanes, boot heels ringing once on grating before the sound died in damp air. Somebody behind her called her name. Not an order yet, just the warning shape of one. She kept walking. The runoff trench along the far edge of the yard held black water, ash, and oily rainbows of diesel spread so thin they only flashed when the light hit right. Fire pulled eyes up and out. Water kept receipts. Koa slowed without command, nose lifting, then dipping again toward the dark ribbon of muck beside the concrete curb. Wind worried at loose metal somewhere downrange and brought the smell of salt, rot with it. Declan Hayes caught up at a half jog, breath short, more from speed than fear. He was younger than the rest of the response lead, face still carrying that clean-boned eagerness some people never lost until the job took it away. Rostova said hold position, he said, falling in on Harper's right, already knowing from her pace that she was not about to do that. Harper didn't answer right away. Koa had found something. You could feel it in the harness before you saw it, that tiny gathering of force through leather and webbing as his body went lower and longer. His tail dropped. His shoulders narrowed. He pulled once, not hard, just enough to turn Harper's wrist toward a runoff seam where clotted gray ash had collected against a rusted drain grate. The smell there was wrong. Not simply burn residue, not just fuel runoff from a shattered training yard. There was a sweeter chemical bite buried in it, flattened by heat but not erased. Hayes crouched without being told and stared at the ash line like it might explain itself if he glared long enough. What is that? Harper crouched too, 2 fingers hovering over the damp debris without touching. She didn't need to touch it yet. Koa had already made the call. The dog's nostrils fluttered, body still locked. No barking, no drama, just work. "The fire was for your eyes," Harper said, keeping her voice low as the wind pushed smoke across the drainage edge in thinning sheets. The dog's going by scent. Hayes looked at her, then at Koa, then back down at the Runoff. He wanted a longer answer. He also wanted not to sound like he needed one. Harper gave him the mercy of brevity. Accelerant trace? Maybe explosive residue. Maybe both. Enough to pull him off centerline. She rose and let Koa take another inch of lead, the harness whispered. That dry shift in the webbing told her more than chatter ever did. He wasn't searching blind. He had a thread now. Hayes swore under his breath and glanced back toward the tent city and the active yard. Toward the command structure he was about to annoy by continuing to follow her. There it was, the decision point. Go back and stay clean, or come forward and get implicated in whatever this turned into. He straightened. I'm coming. Harper gave him a look that asked if he understood the difference between helping and rushing. He must have. He lifted both hands once in surrender and eased a half-step back, leaving space for Koa to work. Smart enough, then. Maybe smart enough to keep up. The trail drew them away from the organized noise and into the kind of quiet that felt temporary, like the place was holding its breath until somebody stepped wrong. The runoff channel bent toward the maintenance side of the installation, where concrete gave way to patched metal, utility piping, chained gates, and blind angles. Koa kept his head low, then lifted once, sorting through diesel, mud, stagnant salt water, hot steel, and whatever chemical note had survived the blast. Harper watched the dog, not the ground, because the ground lied whenever it got crowded. The dog didn't. Rarely. Hayes stayed behind her now. No more questions, boot steps shorter. Learning the rhythm by force. Somewhere ahead, a loose panel knocked once in the wind. Somewhere under them, a pump hummed with that dull, mechanical patience systems always had, the sound traveling up through the soles of her boots. Harper glanced back only once. No one had followed yet. Good or bad? Hard to tell anymore. Koa drew her toward the dark seam where the maintenance perimeter began. All shadowed service lanes and backlit openings where a body could disappear fast if it knew the geography. The leash tightened again. Certainty. Harper felt the shape of the next problem before she saw it. Whoever had built the scene at the blast yard had not finished working. She touched the pistol riding cold against her side, then let her hand fall away. Not yet. Ahead of them, beyond the drainage edge, the maintenance corridor waited in a strip of bad light. Too narrow, too quiet, the kind of place that wanted a silhouette to kill. The corridor announced itself before Harper stepped into it. Geometry did that. The passage ran narrow between sheeted metal and old utility pipe, long enough to make distance feel safe, and tight enough to make safety a joke. A rusted sign on the wall caught the weak spill from a failing fixture and flashed 2 words at her as she angled in, jet blast. Good. A warning meant somebody had once known this place could kill a man without even trying. The grating under her boots rang soft and hollow, every footfall folding back on itself in the metal throat ahead. Koa moved close to the left wall, body compressed, claws whispering instead of clicking. Hayes came in behind Harper, too much speed, still riding in his shoulders. The corridor narrowed toward a hard strip of backlight, where a side opening bled pale glare across the floor. That kind of light made silhouettes out of decent people and corpses out of impatient ones. Harper slowed until slowing itself felt dangerous. The pump hum under the grating thickened. Cooling steel ticked somewhere deeper in the structure. She lifted one hand without looking back. Stop. Breathe. See the lane before the lane sees you. Hayes leaned past her anyway. Not stupid, not clownish, just young enough to think momentum could sometimes bully uncertainty into giving way. Harper caught the front of his vest and hauled him half a step sideways before his shoulder crossed into the glow. Don't step into the light, she said, low and flat. This hallway is begging for a silhouette. Hayes froze, then nodded once, swallowing whatever apology had nearly come out. Good. Noise was taxed now. Harper let her eyes work the corridor the way her hands worked a body. Pipe run along the right. Junction box at knee height. Backlit seam ahead. Dark pocket above the line where the wall braced inward. Kill funnel. Clean and ugly. Koa's harness gave a faint, dry shift as he slid tighter to the wall. Harper followed the dog's line, not his eyes. Eyes could get dragged by shape. Dogs stayed with pattern. There. A thickness in the dark that wasn't pipe or shadow. Human weight hiding where it expected a chest to drift bright into view. Harper drew her pistol in one smooth movement and held it low, muzzle canted toward the corridor's hard surfaces, instead of the dark shape itself. Functional first. Survive the angle. Ask questions later. The figure moved when Hayes breathed. Just a twitch, a shift of balance, enough to prove the geometry had teeth. Harper fired once. She sent the round into the pipe bracket welded chest high, to the right wall, 3 yards short of the ambush point. The shot cracked inside the corridor, like a steel plate slamming shut in her skull. Sparks blew white off the metal. Steam and hot spray kicked sideways when the round punched through something pressurized behind it, and the whole lane turned chaotic for half a second. All glare and hiss and ricocheted sound. That was all she needed. Koa launched forward under the noise, hugging the wall so tight he seemed poured into the shadow. The hidden man flinched back, arm coming up too late to protect his face. Harper drove 2 hard steps in before the ringing in her ears settled, catching only a blur of sleeve, gloved hand, then the violent scramble of someone abandoning a good trap because the room had stopped obeying him. Hayes slammed in behind her, weapon up now but disciplined, covering the gap instead of spraying it. The ambusher vanished through a narrow service cutout at the corridor's end, leaving behind heat, steam, and the metallic stink of ruptured pipe. Harper held long enough to make sure the dark pocket stayed empty, then moved the team through the wrecked lane while the corridor still reeled from the shot. Tinnitus rode her hearing now, a thin wire whine under the pump hum, but she could still track what mattered. Hayes breathing faster but under control, Koa ahead and left, the slap of condensate off ruptured metal, the fading footfall of a man who knew the layout better than any responder should have. At the corridor's end, the space widened into a cramped service bay lined with dented cabinets and chained utility lockers. One steel door stood heavier than the rest. Institutional gray, fresh scrape marks. Around the latch, where somebody had worked it in a hurry. Koa stopped there at once and pressed his nose to the seam, then looked back toward Harper's right hand for confirmation. She gave him the smallest forward flick. Yes, this one. Hayes touched the door and drew back at the chill of it. He went through? Harper looked at the lock, the marks, the path the fleeing shape had chosen. No, she said. He came out of here. The corridor hadn't been the objective. It had been the shield. She set her hand on the handle, feeling the resistance in it, the dead weight of something secured from the inside or slammed in haste. Whatever waited beyond the door had been worth killing for twice. The door didn't swing open so much as give up all at once. Hayes leaned his shoulder into it after Harper worked the damaged latch with the butt of her light, and the steel slab tore free of whatever half-caught hold had kept it shut. The room beyond sat still in the sudden opening, a service shed no bigger than a 2-car garage, packed with coiled hose, rusting brackets, and shelving that seemed to withdraw from the beam as soon as the flashlight touched it. Dust and ash floated thick in the white cone, turning slow as snow that had lost its mind and wandered into heat. Koa entered first by half a body length, silent again, nose low, then higher, then low, once more. The smell hit Harper a beat later, under oil and damp metal and insulation, blood, not fresh enough to announce itself from the doorway, but too much of it once you were inside to belong to a minor injury or a panicked scramble. The blast center sat far out on the pier. This amount of blood had no business being here. Hayes swept the room with his own light and stopped when it found the floor. Jesus. Harper didn't answer. She was already moving toward the dark mass pooled against the grating, mind narrowing down to shape, spread, direction, and what each of them cost in time. Somewhere above them, the building gave a tired metallic hiss as old heat bled out of the frame. She crouched beside the pooled blood and let the beam settle. The metal floor had caught it in the shallow pattern of the grate, then dried it in place. Not splatter from flying debris or random transfer. Volume, gravity, stillness. She tracked the edge of it with 2 fingers, hovering just above the surface, then shifted her light to the long brown-black trail that ran away from the pool in a hard, crooked line. Drag. Something heavy hauled fast by somebody strong enough to care more about speed than neatness. Koa gave one quiet chuff at the seam where the trail cut toward the rear exit and then faded under a smear of old grease. Harper rose and swept the light higher across the room. Hooks, cabinets, a bench scarred by tools. On the far shelf, a scorched housing the size of a lunchbox sat tipped sideways in a nest of rags. One corner burned, shell cracked, inner core intact. Data logger, there it was. Recovered badly, then abandoned in a hurry. Hayes stared from the device to the blood and back again. "You're saying this started here?" Harper stepped to the drag mark and angled the beam down. "I'm saying the explosion borrowed the story. This is where the real one began." She followed the trail to where it bent, then stopped and brought the light back to the pooled blood, as if rewinding a bad decision. This was the part that mattered. Mechanics. She knelt again and pointed, not lecturing, just forcing Hayes to see what she saw. The dead man from the fence line had not simply landed wrong, he had rested wrong first. The blood here had settled broad and patient before anything was moved, and the trail away from it broke into pressure signatures that told the rest. Drag, pause, drag again. A body hauled over metal by someone working against time. Harper let her light trace the line in silence until Hayes sucked in a breath. Good. He was catching up. "A blast wave doesn't push a body in zigzags," she said. "And it sure as hell doesn't leave this much pooled blood in a room the victim supposedly never occupied." She thought back to the cooler skin at the fence, the jaw that contradicted the blast, Caleb with his polished timeline, all of it folded together now with an ugly kind of elegance. Somebody had killed a man in this shed, dragged him out to the perimeter, then lit the yard up so everyone would stare at the obvious corpse and call it the whole story. The blast was cover. The burned body was bait. The wrong body had been the only honest thing in the scene. Once the pattern locked, the next piece came fast and cold. You didn't stage a blast like that to hide a random killing. You did it to buy enough confusion to recover something, erase something, or finish something left alive. Harper lifted the damaged logger from the shelf with 2 fingers and felt the weight of it, heavier than it looked, built to survive impact and not quite surviving greed. Hayes swore softly. So Trent was buying time. "For somebody," Harper said. "And whoever set this up is still inside the perimeter." Koa had moved to the rear service door now, body angled, nose working at the crack beneath it. The same certainty he had given the fence line and the corridor. Harper set the logger back where it had been and fixed the sequence in memory before command could muddy it. Kill here, drag out, stage the yard, contaminate the narrative, retrieve the device, silence the witness, who hadn't died yet. The witness. That was the missing piece. Not the dead, the living. Her pulse kicked once, hard and useful. Outside, beyond the walls, the installation kept trying to behave like an accident scene. Inside the shed, the lie had run out of room. Harper turned toward the back door and tightened her grip on the light. "He's not running blind," she said. "He's hunting the last person who can still sink him." She looked at Hayes and made the next decision fast. "You stay here. Lock this shed down. Hold the logger. Watch the rear exit until recovery gets here." Hayes started to protest, then saw her face and stopped. "Go," he said instead. She did. The low dock opened up all at once after the rear service door. A strip of wet metal and black water jammed between pilings, fuel drums, and the concrete belly of the pier. Harper barely had time to register the space before a shape came off the blind side near the slip ladder and filled the lane in front of her. Big man, dock jacket, shoulders like a loading gate. Gideon Holt hit her fast and ugly. Not with technique, just weight and speed. One hand driving for her weapon side, while the other came across high enough to break teeth if it landed clean. Harper got half a turn instead of a full one. His forearm smashed her shoulder and threw her into the rail. Steel boomed under the blow. The impact shot pain down her arm and back into the ache she had been ignoring since the corridor. Below the grating, the pump hummed with that same dead patience, as if the whole dock had decided to keep working while somebody bled on it. Koa vanished from her left without a sound. Good dog. Good timing. Holt stayed glued to Harper, eyes locked on her hands, her hips, her gun side. Target fixation. There it was. He wasn't reading the whole room. He was reading only the part he thought could hurt him. Boots grated on wet steel. Holt kept coming. That mistake saved her before anything else did. Holt drove in again, trying to crush distance and keep her from drawing clean. Harper let him have part of it. She gave ground on purpose, one boot skidding on wet grit, shoulders turning as if she were losing the angle, when really she was setting it. His reach overcommitted. His balance came forward. She trapped his wrist with both hands, pivoted hard, and sent his momentum into the bulkhead instead of into her chest. The crack of bone or metal or both went off close to her ear. Holt cursed and tried to tear free. Harper didn't try to outmuscle him. That was fantasy for people who liked mirrors. She pinned the arm against the wall with her body, dragged it down, then slammed the hinge of his elbow against the edge of a rusted support bracket. Something gave. Holt roared and twisted, and the knife in his free hand flashed too late for her to stop clean. She got her left forearm up on instinct. The blade cut through sleeve and skin in a hot straight line. Then the feeling changed. Heat first, then a bright cold rush when air hit opened flesh. Blood soaked into her glove. For a split second, the whole dock narrowed to the sound of it hitting metal and the faraway pump still droning under everything. Holt saw the blood and got stupid with it. Narrow, greedy, convinced the wound had become the whole fight. That was the second gift target fixation handed her. He stopped seeing exits, corners, and the empty space behind his own legs. Harper backed once, twice, making him think he had her driven toward the slip, toward open water and panic. He lunged with the bad arm hanging wrong, and the knife hand low and savage. Then Koa hit from the blind side exactly where Harper had needed him to. Zero bark held, no shout, no warning, just a thick, ugly growl trapped in the dog's throat and the wet impact of teeth burying into the back of Holt's calf. Holt's body changed shape around the pain. Confidence went first. Balance went next. He shouted and twisted toward the dog, which was all Harper had been buying time for. She stepped in close, caught his knife wrist with her good hand, hammered her shoulder into his chest, and drove him sideways into the dock railing. The metal rang again. The knife clattered away through the grating and splashed once below. Koa stayed attached long enough to ruin any clean escape, then shifted 2 feet to the side, blocking the only path out with his body low and silent and absolutely certain. He didn't bark. He just locked the target and crushed the man's confidence where it stood. Harper finished it before the fight could turn theatrical. She stripped a plastic access badge and key fob from Holt's belt while he was still trying to decide whether to cradle the ruined arm or the torn leg. He swung once with his good hand, slow now, pain-loaded and desperate. She ducked under it and drove the heel of her palm into his throat just enough to fold him over the rail, coughing. Not to kill, to end the argument. Then she stepped back, breathing hard, blood running from her forearm into her glove, and leveled the pistol she had finally managed to clear without firing it. Holt looked up at her, then at Koa, who stood 2 paces off with his jaws wet and his ears forward and no noise left in him at all. Koa didn't bark. He never needed to. Harper tore the badge free of its clip and saw the contractor stripe through the red streaks, crossing the plastic. Pump access. Good. She pressed her wounded arm once against her side and felt the sting sharpen into something usable. Holt sagged against the rail. Harper closed her hand around the blood-slick keycard and looked past him toward the concrete service tunnel feeding the hidden station below. "Stay," she told Koa. The dog didn't move until she did. Then they went. The pump house door opened on the smell before it opened on the room. Blood hit Harper first, thick and metallic and damp enough to coat the back of her throat. Not the thin copper smell of a nosebleed or a bad cut. This was deeper. Body cavity deep. The key card Holt had been carrying worked on the second pass. Green light flashing once before the lock thunked loose. Harper shoved the steel door inward with her shoulder and stepped into a low mechanical chamber crowded with pipes, valve wheels, and sweating concrete. The pump noise was louder down here. Not one hum anymore, but several layered together until the whole room felt like it had a second pulse under the floor. Koa slipped past her and posted at the entrance without being asked, head turned toward the corridor, body angled to block first and bite second. Julian Cole lay half on his side near the far wall under a bank of control panels, one hand jammed uselessly over his lower abdomen, the other slick with his own blood. His face had gone that waxy gray men wore when they were still alive, mostly out of habit. He tried to speak when he saw her and only got air. Harper was already moving, already counting breaths, color, loss, and time. Blood, machine oil, damp concrete, all of it pressed close. She hit her knees beside him, and her hands went to work before the rest of her caught up. Gauze out, tourniquet out, trauma shears ignored because there was no time for neatness. She tore fabric instead, found the wound by feel and temperature, and the ugly slide of blood under her fingers. Belly hit, low and bad, maybe clipped around the flank too. Enough loss to drown decision if she let him keep spilling. Julian bucked when she pressed in. Good. Pain meant he was still reachable. "Look at me," she said, voice stripped flat. He didn't. His eyes kept skittering toward the ceiling like he was already trying to leave. Harper grabbed a fistful of his shirt and dragged him back to the room. "You can quit after you talk." Not before. Then she packed the wound hard. No grace to it. No bedside softness. Gauze went in by inches under pressure that made Julian cry out once, raw and childlike, before the sound broke into ragged breathing. Harper didn't flinch. She bore down with the heel of her hand until the bleeding changed character under her palm, from active flood to ugly seep. Better. Not good. Better. Her own blood ran off her wrist and mixed with his on the floor, warm for a second before the concrete stole it. The gauze dragged rough and damp across her fingers. Koa held the doorway behind her, in absolute silence. Julian tried to curl around the pain, and Harper blocked it with her forearm. "Stay flat." He shook his head, eyes glassing. "He's gone," he whispered. Harper slipped the tourniquet back into her kit. Wrong injury for it. Different problem. She pulled another stack of gauze and kept pressure where she needed it, then braced her elbow into the concrete for leverage. The room stank of iron, machine oil, and stress sweat. Her gum had long since lost its mint and gone to bitter rubber in the back of her mouth. "I don't need comfortable," she said. "I need breathing. Give me the root." Julian swallowed and almost blacked out doing it. Harper snapped her fingers once, right in his line of sight. "Stay with me." He dragged in air through clenched teeth. "Outflow lane," he said, then coughed and folded around the sound. "Pump gate." Contractor still had access if the locks went hot. "Narrow gate. Service channel." Harper held the words in place while she matched them against the map she'd been building all morning. Not the main vehicle route, not the casualty lanes. A maintenance escape, water adjacent. Hidden enough to bet on if you thought command still believed it was an accident. Smart, mean, predictable. The kind of exit a man trusted when he still believed the system worked for him. Julian's breathing hitched again, and threatened to slide away from her. Harper shoved more gauze into the wound, harder this time, and he jerked so violently his boot scraped concrete. "Stay angry," she told him. "It works better than dying." One corner of his mouth twitched, maybe a laugh, maybe shock chewing through the wiring. Close enough. She cinched a pressure wrap over the packing with quick, brutal turns, then checked his pupils, the skin around his mouth, the speed of his chest. Still here, barely. Enough for somebody else to keep him that way if they got down fast. Koa turned his head once toward her, then back to the door, ears pricked, holding the room while she held the man. Harper touched the radio at her shoulder and sent the shortest call she could live with. Wounded witness, pump house, immediate medical retrieval. Then she looked back at Julian. "You did your part." No promise, no comfort, just a fact. She grabbed Holt's blood, smeared keycard off the floor, shoved herself upright, and felt the gash in her forearm protest. Outside the room, somewhere beyond the pipes and dark service lanes, Thorn was heading for the outflow gate Julian had just handed her. "We go now," she said. Koa was with her before the last word left her mouth. By the time Harper reached the pump gate, the dockside quiet had gone thin and brittle, the kind that cracked if you breathed too hard. The outflow lane was narrower than she had pictured from Julian's gasped directions, boxed in by chain link, concrete, and a service gate fitted with an electronic lock housing the size of a lunch pail. Black water moved below the grating in slow swirls, carrying oil sheen and runoff toward open water. Koa took position without a word from her, low across the only clean path through the lane. Head angled, body still in that way that always felt more final than barking ever could. Harper stood behind him, wounded arm tight to her side, pistol down and out of the argument. Unless the world decided to get stupid again. She had already said what she needed to say into the encrypted channel on the run down here. Blood in the shed, drag marks, jaw fracture, recovered logger, homicide evidence. Wind moved through the fencing and brought her salt, diesel, old algae, and the faint, hot smell of wiring from the lockbox. Then footsteps came down the lane. Not rushed, not lost, confident. Victor Thorn stepped into the mouth of the gate corridor like the place still belonged to him. Even the water sounded like withheld speech. He took them in with one quick sweep that landed first on Koa, then on the blood drying down Harper's forearm, then on the pistol she was not pointing at him. He almost smiled. That was worse than smiling. It said he still thought he understood the board. Contractor badge on his chest. Windbreaker half-zipped. No panic in him yet. Just irritation. "Doctor," he said, like she had wandered into the wrong corridor, on her way to somewhere softer. Harper didn't answer. She watched his hands and the shift in his jaw when he saw the key card no longer clipped where Holt should have had it. He adjusted fast. Good operators always did. He pulled his own badge from inside his jacket and lifted it a little. Not as a threat, more as a fact he assumed would settle things. Koa gave him a low vibration from deep in the chest. Not loud, just enough to let the lane know it already had a claim staked in it. Thorn's eyes flicked to the dog again, then back to Harper. "You're bleeding," he said. "You should get that looked at." Harper held his gaze. The man had built his whole morning on spectacle. Fire, smoke, panic, bodies, contaminated timing. He had counted on people doing what frightened people always did. Looking at the biggest thing first, then calling that survival. Thorn stepped closer to the gate reader and lifted the card. "Move the dog." Harper finally spoke. Her voice came out flatter than she felt, which was useful. "You staged the explosion," she said. "You forgot bodies don't lie." That made him stop. Not freeze. Not confess. Just stop. The line had landed where it was supposed to, not in his conscience, but in his math. For the first time he looked past her toward the yard instead of through her, measuring distance, measuring time, measuring whether somebody at command had truly listened. "You don't know what you think you know," he said. Harper didn't bite. She had no speech for him. The evidence had already spoken. Thorn gave a small shrug, as if the whole thing had become regrettable but manageable, and pressed his badge to the reader. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the reader flashed amber and denied him with a flat, mechanical sound. He frowned and tried again, harder this time, like pressure could bully circuitry. The little light blinked red. Amber. Red again. A countdown in a language he hadn't planned for. That was when the radio on Harper's shoulder split the lane with a double beep, sharp enough to make the steel fencing sing around it. Koa's ears twitched. Thorn's posture changed by a degree so slight someone might have missed it. Harper didn't. She knew the sound. Priority override. Not conversation, not a request. A system deciding to protect itself. Rostova's voice came across the encrypted channel stripped clean of everything but function. Perimeter lock override. Evidentiary seal in effect. Repeat. Evidentiary seal in effect. Pump gate and service lanes are now homicide-controlled access. The words fell cold into the narrow lane, and the installation obeyed them before any person could argue. Red lights snapped alive over the gate housing. The lock gave a dry electronic thud that ran through the chain link and into the grating under Harper's boots. Somewhere behind the gate, heavier mechanisms engaged in sequence, one after another, an industrial clacking that sounded like a jaw closing. Thorn looked at the reader again, as if it had betrayed him personally. He swiped once more. Red. Again. Red. The confidence finally left his face, not in some dramatic collapse, but in the simple realization that the rules had changed without asking him. Koa took one silent step forward and held the lane. Harper didn't raise the gun. She didn't need to. Thorn stood between the locked gate and the dog, and the woman who had arrived carrying a wound and a report. Behind the radio hiss, the base had already started rewriting the event in real time. Not training accident. Not blast mishap. Homicide scene. The loudest thing on the pier had finally lost the argument. An hour later, the command post tent felt quieter than the pump house had, which took work. Outside, cleanup never quite shut up. Engines idled. Boots crossed wet grating. Somebody dragged equipment badly enough to make metal rasp on metal. And every now and then, a radio barked and got cut off too fast. Inside, the air sat heavy and organized. Tables, folding chairs, a map board, a portable lamp throwing honest light over forms nobody would ever call honest. Chief Elena Rostova stood at the far side of the table until Harper came in, then sat without invitation and slid one document across the plywood with 2 fingers. No ceremony, no gratitude. Just paper moving over wood with a dry whisper that sounded too small for what it carried. Koa settled at Harper's boot and stayed there, quiet, jaw clean now, eyes half on the room and half on nothing. Harper looked at the paper before she touched it. Non-disclosure agreement. Temporary compartmentation order. Incident reclassified. Pending higher review. Her forearm had been wrapped by somebody competent enough not to ask for a story. It still throbbed under the dressing. Rostova watched her with the same disciplined bluntness she had worn at the casualty point. "Read it," she said. Not kind, not cruel, just business, under fluorescent strain. Harper pulled the paper closer. The legal wording had been stripped down for speed, which somehow made it more insulting. The blast event, the contractor fraud exposure, the recovered logger, the dead witness, the living one. All of it was being folded into restricted handling before the yard had even cooled. Reclassified pending command review. External disclosure prohibited. Statements routed through base legal. There it was. The phrase she hated on sight. Legal hold. Cold, neat, bloodless. A clean lid placed over a dirty morning. Rostova leaned back in the chair, one hand flat beside her own radio. Fingers finally still, now that the gate had done the heavy lifting for her. "The homicide stands," she said. The evidence stands. Thorn doesn't walk. None of that changes. Harper looked up. What changes? Rostova didn't blink. Who gets to talk about it publicly? Outside, somebody shouted for a forklift and got no answer. Harper read the page again, even though she had already understood it the first time. The system would absorb the truth, yes, but it would absorb it the way concrete absorbed blood. Cover it. Keep it. Pretend the stain had always been part of the floor. You're protecting the installation, Harper said. Rostova gave the smallest shrug in the world. I'm protecting everything that breaks, if this goes wide, before command decides what story it can survive. Harper could have argued. She could have told Rostova exactly what she thought of stories designed for survival instead of truth. She could have stood there bleeding through fresh bandage and made a speech about the dead getting lied about twice. None of that would have changed the paper. None of it would have helped Julian Cole stay alive long enough to testify or kept the logger from vanishing into some locked evidence room with a better badge than hers. So she didn't waste oxygen on the performance. She crouched instead and put a hand on Koa's front paw. The pad was rough and warm under her fingers, still carrying fine grit from the dock. She checked for metal splinters lodged deep in the flesh, then found a tiny nick. Nothing serious, just enough to prove the day had touched him too. Koa stayed still through the inspection, eyes on her face now, trusting the ritual more than the room. Rostova noticed. You always do the dog first? Harper straightened. The dog did his job the first time. Rostova let that sit. Fair enough. They were both too tired for theater. The tent cloth snapped once in a wind gust and then settled again. Only after that did Harper glance at her bandaged arm. Koa leaned lightly against her shin, a quiet correction to everything else the room was asking. Rostova tapped the paper. You sign this, you stay on the inside of the line. You don't, you still stay on the inside of the line. The difference is whether you keep access while it happens. Transactional, clean, ugly. Harper respected it more than an apology would have deserved. This was the actual shape of power. Not medals, not speeches. Just a piece of paper and the knowledge that refusal sometimes changed less than compliance. She picked up the pen. Her hand ached from the cut, the fight, and everything else the body counted whether the mind did or not. She signed. Rostova took the page back immediately, as if leaving it there too long might give the truth an extra route out. Cole made it to surgery, she said. That's what I can give you. Harper nodded once. It was more than nothing. Less than enough. Outside, cleanup kept going. Careless and necessary. Harper rested one hand on the back of Koa's neck and looked toward the tent flap where gray daylight kept trying to work its way in. The loudest thing on the pier wasn't the story. It had just been the cover the story wore, while everyone was still dumb enough to look at fire first.